Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to our webinar on waste management and the circular economy, where our panel of experts will unpack the business opportunities for improved waste management and circular economy systems. Today's webinar is brought to you by Tetra, the National Cleaner Production Centre South Africa, and EnviroServe. We thank our sponsors for their support in making this webinar possible. Before we get started, please be aware that we've enabled the Q&A function, so please post any questions into the Q&A box. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will answer as many of your questions as possible throughout the discussion. To encourage interaction, we've also enabled the chat function, so you can network with the panelists via the chat box. You'll also find this on the bottom of your screen. Please do not, however, post any questions in the chat box, as we may miss them. You can post all your questions into the Q&A instead. Please be aware we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live to YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Chris Whyte, a circular economy specialist with African Circular Economy Network. Chris has been involved in the environmental and sustainable project developments across Africa for many years. His vision is to transition corporates and countries to a circular economy where waste is a resource. Chris will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which includes Lee-Hendor, Ruiters, Strategy and Innovation Manager at the National Cleaner Production Centre South Africa, Masale Manoko, Sustainability Manager at Tetra Southern Africa, Cheri, Scholtz, former CEO at Petco, and Anton, Nahman, Principal Scientist and Research Group Leader for Sustainability, Economics and Waste at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. I'll hand over now to our facilitator, Chris Whyte, to continue with the proceedings. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you also to Creamer Media for the opportunity to host and facilitate this astute panel of individuals. So very nice to have you all here, and welcome to the number of people. We've already got, I think, 230 people online, so I'm looking forward to a few more. What I'd like to do to start off with is I'd really like to give each of the panelists a couple of minutes just to give a little bit more of a description as to kind of who they are, but a couple of minutes each, please, and if I could ask each of them to do that, and if we could start with Cheri.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's Cheri Scholtz, and I've spent the last 20 years developing PET recycling and more latterly getting involved in liquid board recycling, starting a voluntary producer responsibility organization and then transitioning that into, of course, a regulated one. And I really look forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Cheri. Anton, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sharon. Hi, everyone. Anton Nahman from the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. So I'm the research group leader for a research group called Sustainability, Economics and Waste. So we have a focus on all things sustainability, essentially, but our main focus is on issues related to circular economy and waste. So maybe a bit different from some of the other panelists in that our focus is obviously more on the research side, not so much on the implementation. But yeah, very excited to be part of this panel and discussion.
Thank you, Anton. And Lee-Hendor?
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone and all the panelists. My name is Lee-Hendor. I'm from the National Cleaner Production Centre of South Africa, and I'm responsible for our programs on circular economy and industrial spaces. I've been working in the NCPC for just over 15 years. Of course, our mandate is on resource efficient and cleaner production methodologies, and we interface directly with industry. So over the past 15 years, I have worked with a number of different sectors, supporting them to adopt these methodologies that ranges from life cycle management to circular economy initiatives and resource efficiency. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. And to Masale.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Masale Manoko. the sustainability manager for Tetra Pak in Southern Africa. My role is basically primarily focused on developing collection and recycling value chains for liquid board packaging in our region, with a core focus of working with all the 4 tiers of waste management in South Africa, from waste pickers to the end of use cycle, whereby we've got people that are beneficiating some resultant materials that come out of our packaging. Nice to meet you all. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. So, as I said, quite an esteemed panel, and I've had the privilege of working with many of you for many years, and hopefully many years more. Much appreciated. I've been at it for 35 years, so hopefully not too many more years. But really, what we're focusing on here today is looking at the issues around waste management and the incorporation of circular economy. So I'm hoping we can shed some light on that today for everybody online. And I'm going to start off literally just by going through asking a number of questions to the panelists. I'm going to start off with Lee. In terms of kind of where we're coming from, although our sort of formal waste collection stats in South Africa are really not doing that well over the last 20 years or so. Apparently, we're sitting at about 63% formal collection at the moment, which is not fantastic. We're still claiming that 90% of the country's waste goes to landfill, despite the existence of a range of alternative management opportunities. So, Lee, what business opportunities do improved waste management and the transition to a circular economy present, in your view?
Thank you, Chris. And I think you're raising such an important question, because we see that business opportunities and economic growth is an important focus area for our economy. And so when we look at improved waste management, the approach involves implementing a number of structured activities in order to prioritize waste stream utilization. The improvement or improved waste management should target promoting recycling and also engaging communities on sustainable waste practices to encourage SMEs, to encourage the development of infrastructure. So, of course, there's very, very early on, there's been a lot of focus on entrepreneurial opportunities. And when we look at initiatives like industrial symbiosis, which identifies waste streams to create value for inputs into other processes or manufacturing activities, we find that this provides a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs to look into opportunities like textile processing, whether it's things like pallet recycling or value adding to waste streams. There becomes an important need for looking at the material recovery facilities that can allow and can stimulate these entrepreneurial activities and ultimately amplifying the business opportunity. So material recovery facilities, when we talk about things like the recycling infrastructure, it creates an important foundation for getting these waste value streams, adding value to it, and getting these waste streams to be utilized by entrepreneurs, and also in order to look at amplifying and extending these different business opportunities. And of course, it also starts impacting the opportunities for companies that's in the waste management space, and providing opportunities for businesses to design products in such a way that it can be recycled. Recyclability can improve, remanufacturing can improve, and also repurposing can be improved when looking at these different waste streams. Of course, job creation and growth links. It's an important link between improved waste management and circularity. And of course, this is where circular business models become an important part for these business opportunities to be built on, and ultimately to make sure that products or opportunities for extending the life cycle of products can be taken advantage of, and ultimately ensuring that the waste is diverted from landfill sites. So this is a process that is quite when we talk about improved waste management, this is an important process that it becomes a very comprehensive approach. And of course, aligning to national policies and strategies is an important part, but understanding how different players within the business community plays a role, and where these opportunities, the needs and opportunities sit, that can really drive the business opportunities. That's an important part to take note of. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, Chris. And I think just the message I want to amplify is that this is quite an important focus for business opportunities.
I'm going to follow up on that quickly, Lee. Just in terms of, you've contextualized it in terms of the importance and the structure of that, but how does the NCPC engage? What does the NCPC do in terms of creating these opportunities?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Chris, from our side, we've developed a number of programs to engage industry. One of our programs that we are working quite extensively on in a number of provinces is on our industrial symbiosis program, that also identifies industrial synergies. And this looks at building capacity at a provincial level, provincial government level, but also within the different provinces, creating a platform where waste exchange can be facilitated between SMEs, between businesses. We're also now looking at how this can be done at an industrial park level. So through our industrial parks program, industrial synergy becomes quite a critical part to driving the circular principles within industrial spaces. And so fostering collaboration between companies in industrial parks and also companies in different industrial parks is now becoming an important part of that. Part of also what we do is, I mentioned the resource efficiency. We have also quite a big focus on the textile sector, where we have a number of programs that supports circularity within textiles, targeting the efficient use of resources, the reduction of material and chemicals within the sector. But then I mentioned earlier on business models through the Intex project that is focused on driving the adoption of business models within the textile sector, circular business models within the textile sector, to increase and extend market reach, and also extending the life cycle of products through remanufacturing and repurposing of textiles, and looking at the product environmental footprint of those textiles products. And then lastly, our focus on training in the NCPC through our resource efficient and cleaner production training we offer to industry, that also includes circular economy, focus on circular economy, as well as focus on waste management and industrial symbiosis. So these are broadly the activities that helps us to engage industry and foster the business opportunities and uptake of that within the waste management and circular economy.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. So I think, leading on from that, or building on that, Anton, yeah, there's less than glowing stats in terms of collection and landfill in South Africa. We know that our existing refuse dumps are under increasing pressure amid growing waste generation. How can we look at the advancement of the circular economy to help us improve this situation from your perspective?
Sure, thanks, Chris. So, I mean, in short, the circular economy is about reducing the amount of waste that's generated in the first place. So if you look at the way our current economic model works and its relationship with waste, so we're running a very linear type of economic system, and waste is inevitable in the system. It's kind of built into the system, if you like. So we're extracting resources, we turn them into products. Many of these products we don't really use for a very long period of time, or in some cases we don't even need them necessarily. And then we dump them into landfills or we're still into the environment. And of course, with population growth and with income growth, increasing volumes of products being put on the market, as I've said, many of which are single use or have a very short lifetime. So it's inevitable that waste management systems just won't be able to deal with the increasing volumes of waste that are being generated. So I think where the circular economy comes in is that, so focusing on managing waste once it's already been generated, it's kind of like trying to put a Band-Aid on the problem. So you're addressing one of the symptoms, which is waste, but you're not really addressing the root cause, which is the linear economic system. So the aim of a circular economy is to shift the focus away from only trying to address waste kind of at the end of pipe, but towards actually rethinking and redesigning our product systems, and in fact, the economic system as a whole, to ensure that less waste is generated in the first place. So in fact, yeah, it's around designing waste out of the system, which is, of course, one of the three principles of the circular economy. The others being to circulate products and materials at their highest value and to regenerate natural systems.
As long as possible.
Yeah, and each of these principles are driven by design. So in practical terms, the way that this can be implemented is, and I think Lee alluded to this in his responses as well, is to look at the various types of R strategies. So before we get to the stage of recycling, before products even reach their end of life, but actually to focus more on the more upstream types of interventions. So you're rethinking, reducing, and redesigning. Also your midstream interventions, repairing, reusing, repurposing, as opposed to the business as usual, which of course is just focusing on dealing with waste once it's already been generated. And even recycling can only get us so far, especially if we're not really addressing the upstream aspects and ensuring that our products are properly designed for recycling. So many products are not designed to be easily recycled, or they make use of materials that can't be easily separated or recycled, which means that recycling rates are generally quite low. And of course, recycling is also energy intensive, and it simply can't keep up with the volumes of waste that are being generated. So that's why we need to focus more on these upstream aspects. So things like, and again, Lee spoke to this to some extent, rethinking the business model, the way that we're making and using our products, the resources that we're using, reducing and refusing. So reducing the number of products being put on the market, avoiding products that we don't really need. And of course, probably most importantly, designing for circularity. So designing products to be more durable, longer lasting, and repairable, so that we don't have to keep throwing things out and buying new things. Designing products for reuse rather than for single use. Designing products to be easily dismantled, repurposed, refurbished, or as a last resort, recycled. And obviously a component of that as well is eliminating problematic materials and products that can't actually be easily recycled. So by implementing these upstream strategies, the aim is to design waste out of the system and thereby reduce the amount of waste generated, which of course will in turn ease the pressure on our landfills.
Thank you. That's a good good summary in terms of how we look at that from what circularity brings to that. Obviously, that's looking at all the different waste streams and the different issues around that. Yeah, but yeah, let's bring it down to one particular waste stream. So let's look at this from a PET perspective. And get Petco's perspective in this line of thought. So, Cheri, what are the biggest challenges facing the PET recycling system in South Africa, and how can we look at industry and government working together to overcome these?
I think that the first challenge is really design related. You know, we're collecting around about 64% of post-consumer PET bottles on the market. And of course, if you look at what do PET bottles consist of, you know, it's made of beverage bottles, home and personal care, edible oil bottles and jars like mayonnaise and peanut butter, as well as thermoform trays. But as I say, about 70% is beverage, which These bottles are ideal for recycling if they're really well designed. So if they're clear and light blue bottles, they're best. If they have very easy to remove labels with water-soluble glues, they're fine for recycling and recycled content. Opaque, green and amber bottles are really a challenge. Shrink sleeve labels are the kiss of death. And these are those labels that cover the whole bottle.
Yeah.
So-called biodegradable PLA bottles are a challenge. And my pet peeve is PVC contamination. And these come in the form of honey bottles and some personal care bottles. Very few of them, but completely detrimental to the PET recycling stream because they're the same density and they are not collected and they're not sorted out, to be rather frank. So we have eco-modulation in our Section 18 legislation, but it's impossible to implement in a totally open, competitive PRO market. In fact, it hasn't even worked in the highly regulated and experienced EU market. So much so there that they are changing their directives on that line. So what could we do about it? I think we could really implement and enforce targets that allow a level playing field for PET and its contaminants like PLA and PVC. So if you can't remove, I mean, I dare ask, is PVC packaging needed at all? It's a fantastic product for hospitals and healthcare, but is it needed in the packaging sector? And if it's in packaging, it should at least have the same target and enforcement that PET has so that the playing fields are level. I think make product identification compulsory and not voluntary. And anything that is PET plus something else, like PETG, which is PET glycol, it is not PET. It must be marked with a number 7 and a descriptor on what that additional product is. So if it's glycol or anything else. I think quality in collection is as important as quantity. So what would be really helpful would be to clarify roles and responsibilities with regard to municipal waste infrastructure and curbside collection. Who is responsible for doing what by when? Enforce recycled content targets, enforce them, and introduce them for other plastics. Keep the playing fields level so that you don't have big discrepancies in targets and unintended consequences of moving to products that are not recyclable or can't have recycled content. The other day, I happened to be in a retailer and I saw some bottles with opaque bottles with big shrink sleeves. So of course, I darted over to them to go and pick them up so that I knew who to contact, much to my surprise, to find their PP bottles. Now, of course, in a circular economy, there is no recycled content for PP. So one wonders what the thinking behind that was. And if they really have to be opaque, they were actually nut milks, alternative milks. So I think also enforce targets for collection and recycling. Make sure that they are met by all of the 28 registered paper and packaging PROs. And monitor the infrastructure development that all of these PROs do. So there isn't sort of cannibalization on existing infrastructure. And work towards data harmonization and prevent free riding. So I think essentially governance and system optimization, which is monitoring and harmonizing reporting, making sure everyone's measuring at the same place, because if you don't measure something properly, you don't know how to sort it out. So I think, Chris, that's probably enough to start with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of components that are brought up in that, and thank you for that response. What you've shown obviously is that I think a lot of people think PET is a bottle. There are a lot of different forms of PET and a lot of different applications one needs to look at. So there are a number of different components one needs to look at with regards to the entire sort of chain, looking at what's in the packaging. And there's a number of different options around that. But you know, we're struggling with infrastructure and collection, and we're talking harmonization and compliance. So yeah, we've got a long way to go. but I think that with the PROs and the EPRs and the government, that we've got the right sort of systems and processes going forward to make that happen. But we need everybody to participate in that. Thank you. Just so the PET, as I said, it's not PET is everyone thinks is a very simple sort of, I mean, you can't even call it a monomer. It's a polymer, but it sounds like there's only one PET, but there's a lot. Tetra Pak, Masale, is a material that's a little bit more complicated than single polymer PET. So what is Tetra Pak Southern Africa incorporating circular economy principles into its solutions, and what progress has been made with regards to recyclability of your particular products?
Oh, thank you, Chris. I think that we firstly need to look at the package in itself. Our packages basically go out to serve a different market, which is long life foods that are out there in the market. But if you look at what Tetra Pak has been doing, is that innovation has been at our core to continuously improve our packaging. What we have done is that we have moved from, firstly, as Anton has alluded to, we need to design for circularity. We started by basically moving away from some fossil-based polymers in our packaging, like our caps and some of the layers. And just for interest's sake, our packaging is 75% paper, 25% polyethylene, and 5% aluminum. So we do understand that the paper component of our packaging is easily recyclable. But then we've got this 30% that remains. And what we have done is that we started with the design, whereby we started replacing some fossil-based polymers with bio-based polymers that are made from sugarcane. And we didn't just stop there. We understand that aluminum is not a renewable resource, and Tetra Pak has worked quite extensively in our research and innovation departments to ensure that we replace the aluminum barrier in our packages with a fiber-based barrier. And as we speak right now, there are markets like Portugal that are currently trialing these packages with this fiber-based barrier. And this just goes to show that our commitment to circularity and making sure that our packages are designed for the circular economy continues. But it just doesn't stop there as well, as that if you look at our packages and the way they're structured, in the Southern Africa market, we needed to ensure that we do have capacity to process them in their current form. And Tetra Pak has invested more than 54 million into this market, whereby we've developed capacity to recycle not only the paper component, but we've gone on further to process the polyethylene and aluminum components to form pellets, which can be used as a raw material in the plastic industry. After that, we even went further and partnered with some partners in the plastic recycling industry to manufacture products such as pellets, such as boards, such as layer boards, and some other products like bread crates. So we are not only stopping at funding these projects, we're working actively with all these partners to ensure that we develop circularity for our packages from start to finish. I think for now, I'll just leave it there as a start.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the whole thing around circularity is, again, looking at designing for recyclability, and the fiber side. A fiber-based barrier, I think, is a great idea, because the polyally has always been, or the final mix after the fiber with the polymer and the aluminium has always been a bit of a problem. I know that there are some solutions for it, but it's more sort of a downcycling than a recycling. So it's good to see that is moving into the right direction. So we talk about the fact that we're talking about the circular economy here, we're talking about waste management, but we really want to try and get it across also to the attendees online that circular economy is not just another buzzword for recycling. And the principles that Anton alluded to earlier can be applied to just about any sector. And there's a lot of work around that in terms of many of the different organizations in South Africa. Circular South Africa, which is driven by ASIN, incorporates a lot of the players and role players in this market to look at those key issues. But in your view, Anton, why should the circular economy extend beyond the waste sector, and particularly with the global resource demand, climate mitigation, and other issues that are on the rise? Where else can we take circular economy?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's important actually that we do stop equating the circular economy with waste or with recycling, because I think, it's about much more than that. So I think it's about rethinking and redesigning, our whole economic system, moving away from this very materials and energy intensive linear economy that's contributed, not only to waste, but also resource scarcity, biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change. And of course, it cuts across all economic sectors. So it's definitely not just a waste issue. So, for example, the CSIR has recently conducted a number of studies across various sectors, and we've identified over 100 different circular economy opportunities across various high impact sectors of the economy, such as mining, agriculture, manufacturing, mobility, and human settlements, as well as interventions relating to energy and water, which of course also cut across all economic activity. So the circular economy provides significant opportunities for achieving our commitments relating both to climate change and sustainable development. So it really allows us to reduce our reliance on the extraction of primary resources, thereby avoiding resource scarcity and depletion, and also reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of resource use, for example, the linear economy is of course very resource intensive. We're using valuable resources only once, then throwing them away and continually extracting new resources, which of course seems like, quite a senseless way of doing things. Whereas the circular economy is about retaining the value of resources, keeping them circulating productively within the economy, rather than just dumping them into landfills and then extracting more resources. So by keeping the resources circulating within the economy, we're of course avoiding the need to continually extract new resources. And of course, this pertains to all economic sectors, and particularly in the South African context. If we look at the need to decouple our economic growth from resource use, it creates opportunities to better manage risks in terms of future resource constraints and to build resilience in the face of global economic uncertainty. So we've got this current, heavy reliance of our economy on exports of raw materials. This really puts the resilience of our economy at risk, as other countries transition towards circularity themselves. And of course, in the current, political and economic climate where there's possibilities of reduced trade with some of our historic key trade partners, their demand for our resources is obviously going to decline. So it's therefore really important that we start rethinking the way that we utilize our resources in order to safeguard our future economic development. And we also need to look at transitioning our economy so it's not only reliant on extracting and exporting raw materials and importing finished products, but that we're really localizing production processes further along the value chain. Again, this speaks to various sectors of the economy. And this is really, key for our economic growth and job creation. And then you spoke to climate as well. So of course, the linear economy is also very super, energy and carbon intensive. So all along the linear value chain, especially in resource extraction and processing, there's huge amounts of energy being used, which of course contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And global studies have actually shown that material extraction and use account for about 70% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're reducing raw material extraction and keeping products and materials in circulation, we're obviously contributing significantly to reducing emissions. Studies have also shown that, through more efficient and circular use of just 4 key materials, being cement, steel, plastics, and aluminium, circular economy strategies can help reduce global emissions by as much as 40%, and rising even to 50% if we include circular approaches within the food system as well. And then bringing it back home in South Africa, so a recent study by the CSIR has shown that, given the carbon intensity of our resource use, circular interventions in a few strategic sectors can really assist in decarbonizing economic activity. So our conservative modeling shows that circular economy measures can reduce emissions in 2050 by around 34%, which would keep emissions to below their 2019 levels. Yeah. And this speaks particularly to key sectors like agriculture, mining, construction, manufacturing, and transport.
No, agreed. And I think this is important to try and get it across to attendees, is that there is a level of depth to circular economy that goes beyond just the waste and recycling side of things. There is still a link there. If we look at the issues across Africa, simply in terms of climate change around agri-food systems and agroforestry, there are massive opportunities for us to transition. We have some of the best innovations in this country in terms of looking at alternative building materials and low carbon building materials, and we need to make those transitions. So there was a question that popped up just in terms of somebody asking about the access to the CSIR notes that you've got on the different sectors. If you could find that in the chat and just pop in the website address that they can find that on as well, that'd be quite useful.
Yeah.
So just to take that further then, with regards to, I'm going to come back to Lee. In terms of the understanding that circular economy is not just about waste and recycling, and how we bring in the other principles of circularity. So Lee, you mentioned it briefly before, and it's we're not just talking about the end of life. It's not just when we get to the end of life we're talking about recycling. But if we don't design and manufacture for circularity, we're missing opportunities to create circularity later on. So I'd like you to add to that and just talk about some of the work that we can do with regards to design for recyclability and looking at that value chain before we get to the end of life.
Thanks, Chris. I think Anton gave such a good summary of that because it really boils down to understanding the industry or the sector that you're in. So when you want to design and when you want to apply and adopt circular principles within your business model, you have to understand the value chain that you're in. And I think we do that quite well when you look at life cycle assessments. You have to place yourself within that value chain, and you have to understand how do you contribute, as a business or as a sector to climate change or contribute to carbon emissions or any other waste into the waste streams. So, and you mentioned that design is one of those principles that really allows you to get a head start on impacting so much along your value chain or your operations, and designing of products and systems with circularity in mind. It comes from the start, from the outset, is essential for maximizing your benefits for circular economy. So if the products are not designed for recyclability or reusability, I saw in one of the messages there was also a question around biodegradability, and you miss those opportunities to be circular. The approach, this approach is of course to ensure that materials are used efficiently. So when you design and you invest in designing your products in a circular and efficient way, you can reduce your waste output, you use your materials more efficiently, and you are able to easily get into the recycled value chain. So that is, I think, one of the opportunities that design and circular design creates for businesses. By also integrating circular design early on in your product life cycle, you can unlock new opportunities. You can pivot into other business opportunities, and through this, you can still contribute to sustainable development. So yes, reduced waste, increased efficiency, you can improve your competitive advantage, and this all contributes to what we want to see in industry, which is competitiveness improved and increased competitiveness in our industries. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I mean, it's also quite important for people to understand that the application of circular principles through the value chain allows for impact along the value chain, and that opportunity allows for many other options in terms of economic development and looking at SME development, just transition opportunities, because it opens up that whole value chain to start looking at all the different components of it. So thank you for unpacking that. It does make a lot of sense. I'm going to go back to Masale just to try and follow up on that from Lee's response. How's the packaging industry and specifically Tetra Pak leveraging innovation and new materials to reduce its environmental footprint? You've spoken about fiber-based barriers, but again, Anton was speaking about the multi-sectoral component, and Lee was talking about the value chain. We can look at different components, alternative fibers. We're talking, there's hemp and banana and all sorts of other things that are happening. What is your input in terms of looking at innovation and new materials in terms of the packaging?
Okay, thanks, Chris. As I said before, Our key focus is to always move to a much more renewable resources that comprise our packaging of, and also exploring reusable materials in our packaging. As I said before, that we are now moving to the fiber-based barriers because we're trying to remove these non-renewable resources. But also, if you look at Europe, we're also now exploring using some recycled polymers in some of our packages. But however, due to food safety regulations, we need to make sure that we do this properly and also keeping true to our core principle, which is making food safe, available for everyone. So we need to make sure that we responsibly source materials, test them thoroughly, and make sure that when we deploy them into the market, we deploy them where they'll be able to serve the purpose that they're intended for. So we've done quite a lot in that space, to the extent that also even now, if you look at South Africa, we don't only just look at the design component of it. We've gone even further to make sure that the circularity of our packages actually works. For example, in South Africa, in 2022, we were sitting at 4% recycling rate of our packages. And what we have managed to do is to put focused, dedicated interventions into the market that have allowed us to grow the recycling rate to over 20%, where we are now exceeding government regulations. And how did we get there? Firstly, we started with the right partnerships. We worked with partners like the CSIR to properly understand what the value chain requires and where should we place our efforts to make sure that we are geared for success. Secondly, we then partnered with a responsible PRO that has got shared principles and values similar to our own. We then, after that, went into the market and started working actively with the value chain to make sure it succeeds. Like, for example, you look at some of the interventions that we've put in that are additional, like deploying 11 young graduates into the market to work with smaller buyback centers to larger ones on a key account basis. These people are deployed into the market to actively work with these parties that need to boost the collection and recycling efforts. But also, they give us much more credible insights in terms of what is it that needs to be done. The information that we get back, which we collect through a system that Tetra Pak has developed together with Petco, where we get real-time insights on a business-by-business case, allows us to be able to put interventions regionally or provincially, or even down to the town, where we put interventions that really matter and make sure that we make a difference because we understand the challenges that we find there. So our approach to circularity, as I said, just starts at the design. We look at alternative materials, but we make sure that what we're putting out there into the market is also collected and recycled at scale.
I mean, it's essential as well. I mean, you talk about, I mean, part of circularity could also be looking at the digitalization, making sure that we measure. You can't manage it if you can't, if you're not measuring it. And those sort of issues are critically important in terms of again, looking at the different components around PROs and EPRs, around measurement and verification and report packs. So it's all part of the value chain to ensure that we do follow through on that. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to throw it back to Cheri as well, because we spoke about there's a number of different types of PET, and we know that Petco has also been involved in assisting with Tetra Pak as well. But if you look at the variation, so Tetra Pak's at 20% aiming for 40%. I think PET's at 65% aiming for 80%. I can't remember the exact numbers. Obviously, there's a strategy still from Petco's perspective in terms of improving this from 2025 going forward. But then I'd also like to just unpack some of the key issues around that non-bottle PET. Looking at the thermoforms and the other different challenge waste streams and non-recyclable plastic waste streams. What are we doing from that perspective, Cheri?
Well, in terms of if we focus on PET to start with, and we look at thermoforms, we have closed loop recycling, we have open loop recycling, or downcycling, as some people call it. Now, what's really interesting is that when we started Petco 20 years ago, on a voluntary basis, we started with what we call a bottle to fiber market, because PET is part of the polyester chain. So if you look at the consumption of PET globally, by far the biggest amount goes into the textile sector as polyester, which we all wear every day, and in some form or another in all of our clothes, things that have got stretch, etc. A much smaller component actually goes into rigid packaging, which is what we call PET. So we started off, because you can't collect a product if you can't reprocess it into something else, and it needs to have a certain value, or you can't fund that chain. So the principle at Petco is to build sustainable value chains. So what we did was we started, because there was no PET being collected in the country at all. In fact, in the 5 years before Petco was incorporated, in over 5 years, I think about 4,500, 5,000 tons was collected. There simply wasn't consistent demand. So what we did was we found an end-use market, which was a fiber plant, interestingly enough, situated outside South Africa. But we had an end-use market and we unpacked the value. And so we started collecting bottles. We subsidized them. We paid a contribution towards every kilogram collected, which suddenly meant those bottles had a value they didn't have before. And we utilized the informal sector, because in South Africa, as we all know, we have an unemployment challenge, and it made no sense to go for a high-tech kind of solution when actually it makes more sense to provide opportunities for people. So we started off with a bottle-to-fiber model, more cost-effective and also based on informal collection, landfill collection, more forgiving because of the quality. But way back in 2004, we drafted a 15-year business plan, and we knew that by 2015, we were aiming for 50%. And I'm talking about post-consumer bottles. We've never measured pre-consumer or commercial industrial. We also knew what the size of the fiber market in South Africa was. So we knew that after forecasting X growth and X tons, we knew that we would then need to move to a far more expensive option, which would be closing the loop. So in 2011, we closed the loop, and we were by then fulfilling the polyester staple fiber needs of the country. We don't import any polyester staple fiber into South Africa today. Okay, so all the pillows, duvets, carpets that are made from polyester are actually from recycled bottles. But we had then the feedstock coming through, the collection chain coming through, and we had the capacity and the capability to start actually turning the better quality bottles into food grade bottles. Now, we could have started recycling thermoform trays into fiber quite a while ago. But the question about recyclability and the definition of recyclability is a really interesting one, because just because a material is technically recyclable somewhere, there are economies of scale, there's sustainability, there's the value of what you can recycle that product into, and essentially extended producer responsibility funds that gap. And we were unable to get the financial support from essentially one of the biggest tray producers in the country to fund that chain, but we could have been. We did a trial actually with one of our contracted recyclers way back. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but we thought that we would, because remember, thermoform trays contain quite a high content of recycled material in them, around about 35%, and they are very light. Okay, so they weigh about 21 grams. So we did a trial to see what sort of yield we would get, and we made a fiber, not an A-grade fiber, but certainly a fiber that could go into carpeting, but it's a service package as well. So quite challenging in service packaging to identify who the producer is. Because, for example, your biggest users are really at point of sale use, you know, bakeries, delis. So how do you identify the brand that is there? So slightly more complicated value chain. Our recyclers now believe that they have upgraded their wash plants to take more edible oil bottles. Certainly Extra Pet have done that. But what is critical with trays is marking. Okay, if you look at a PET tray and you look at a PP tray, it's very difficult to tell the difference. Now, if you're an informal collector and you are collecting, what do you go for? The informal collectors on the ground know what they can sell. They know the value of recyclables better than anyone. So right now, aluminium is your highest value, PET your second highest value. Tetra Pak and liquid board cartons, we've subsidized that value using the same methodology of the Petco plan. And that is why they get collected. So you've got to keep that balance. You've got, in order to keep that sustainable supply chain at any one stage, you've got to balance your end use demand, critical. You've got to have the capacity and capability. And then, of course, you've got to have the feedstock coming through. So I don't want to carry on. I could tell you more about, mayonnaise and peanut butter, but we can come back to that. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's just understanding also, I mean, so the key thing that you said there is that one has to have an end-use market in terms of creating a value. And I think that's also where we need to understand sometimes that's not always possible, and that's also why EPR and PROs are there to push that, because ultimately we don't want to perpetuate a cherry-picking society where we're only looking at the high-value waste. So there's still a lot of products that are in that polymer chain which need to be looked at, and there are systems which, as you say, are not always considered to be recycling, downcycling or upcycling or closed loop, but there are options. And I think that that's also where products can be manufactured from those. But we also need to look at making sure that the market is accepting those. So there needs to be some level of procurement preference or certification that allows us to develop markets for some of these other products as well. And I think that's very much lacking in South Africa at the moment. I think even if we look at the housing market, talking about different products that can be converted into industrial grade products for housing components, as an example, trying to get through the certification and compliance and legislation is also just a huge blockage from that perspective.
I agree with you, Chris, and I think open loop recycling is a far better alternative to waste to energy. I think at least then you have material substitution, and you can also have a plan to actually develop materials further. But very exciting things are happening around the world. The Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive coming in Europe by 2029 is going to create a lot of changes. And I think that there's certainly been an uptick in research. C-Flex, for example, for flexible multi-layer packaging, which is light. So we're in quite exciting times. And I think if we have a clear circular economy action plan, and if we can also look at incentives, to help people and producers make those changes, I think that's going to help as well, so that it's not always a stick, but sometimes a carrot, a balance.
Agreed. Yeah, I think we are in some exciting times. It's a bit harrowing trying to keep up at times. I mean, the things are changing so quickly. So it's really good to kind of see how we manage to stay up to speed with that. But it's important in terms of looking at all these different things into context, and that brings in probably the next question for Anton. I think is that we know there's a lot of organizations driving circularity in South Africa. Circular South Africa is one platform that's been created that allows those to plug and play along those different components and understand how we work together. But we're seeing policy, we're seeing plans and a shift to move and meet the needs of the country. And one of those is the recent science, technology, and innovation for circular economy strategy, which was done with the DSI, with a clear focus there on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I want to bring it to Anton. So Anton, again, from a CSR perspective, obviously very clearly that's where you come from. What are the science, technology, and innovation issues critical to the country's transition to a more circular economy approach that supports not just the socioeconomic development, but also the just transition that we talk about.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the role of STI, science, technology, and innovation, it's absolutely critical in ensuring, you know, a transition to a circular economy that's just and equitable in the South African context. So in fact, there's been a number of previous policy documents before the STI strategy. So the STI white paper, as well as the Department of Science and Innovation's decadal plan, which really highlighted the important catalytic role of STI, and that a circular economy really must be driven by evidence and supported through innovation. So some specific examples of the types of STI needed include things like identifying opportunities for circular economy interventions across a number of key sectors, and I've already alluded to some of the work that's already been done to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think importantly, developing new and innovative technologies, new types of business models, materials, processes, and other types of interventions to enable circularity. And in particular, innovative solutions that are relevant in a developing country context. So a lot of solutions are obviously, you know, developed internationally, and they're not potentially not relevant in a South African context. So we need to look at ways of how we can develop solutions that are tailored to our context, and that will actually allow us to leapfrog in a way the development pathways of the global north, which are obviously based in a highly linear economic model. So, for example, building on what already works well in a developing country context, where practices such as repair and repurposing are already, you know, commonplace in a lot of contexts.
Mm.
Also, you know, STI to unlock opportunities and enable implementation of circular economy interventions through pilot and demonstration projects, which also helps to de-risk investment in circular economy activities. And then I think, yeah, where my interest particularly comes in, and where our particular team focuses is on providing evidence to inform the circular economy transition. So assessing the environmental, social, and economic benefits and costs of a circular transition, particularly in a developing country context like South Africa. So we've got a lot of evidence of how that works in a developed country context, but not so much in our context.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly the benefits in terms of job creation, I think there's a real need to understand those benefits in the developing country context. Also understanding how best to actually implement the transition in our context in a way that will actually maximize these social and economic and environmental benefits and minimize any potential negative impacts. For example, we need to understand the types of processes and institutional structures that may best enable the realization of a circular economy.
Mm.
Also, obviously, assessing specific new types of technologies or products and other interventions from an environmental, social, and economic perspective. So we really need to understand, you know, which types of technologies or processes would be most impactful to ensure that they actually will have a positive social, economic, and environmental impact, and to avoid greenwashing. So obviously, oftentimes new technologies come along that are touted as being green or circular, but often that's not necessarily the case. So you really need evidence to assess these things, particularly from a full life cycle perspective. So that's where tools like life cycle assessment become really critical, because they understand, you know, new technologies or new materials or products that are coming in that might have certain environmental benefits, but might cause other types of benefits costs or impacts elsewhere along the value chain. And then also in terms of tracking material flows and circularity. So we need to monitor our progress in the transition to a circular economy through material flow analysis, for example. And you've mentioned the circular economy STI strategy, which is due to be launched quite soon. So as you've said, it aims to support an inclusive, just, and climate resilient circular economy transition through science, technology, and innovation. So the strategy highlights that a circular economy transition needs evidence and demonstration to showcase the benefits of a circular economy, and also the types of institutional structures, governance processes, and social cultural interventions that are needed to really drive the paradigm shift that's required.
Well, I mean, it makes sense, and I think this is one of the critical issues: is you know, evidence-based approaches. I mean, we know that from international investigations that the world is only sitting at about 7.2% circular, which is pretty dismal in terms of where we need to get to. And a lot of that really comes from evidence flows and looking at those sort of material flows to be able to measure that and at least be able to kind of see where we're coming from. I'm not sure if Lee wants to add on to that as well because I also want to ask Lee, in terms of the barriers, and I don't want to start getting into policy because then I get all hot under the collar and angry with certain issues. But there's a lot that we can do as a country and as experts in the field to unlock the opportunities. There's a lot of barriers to expanding circular economy opportunities: lack of infrastructure, the skills, lack of investment. How can we as a country scale up successful circular economy initiatives to create more economic opportunities? And does this STR strategy assist with that, Lee?
Thank you, Chris. Well, yeah, I think, if you just look at the chat, you'll pick up a lot of those challenges that is clearly evident, and that a lot of SMEs do experience and businesses do experience. Scaling up is always a challenge, and I think a lot of people would almost say that, how do you scale up something that doesn't work properly yet? Let's get to the point of making it work. And I think that's really what when you talk about scaling up, just the concept of scale up is all about, having a successful test run, and then, getting the learnings from that, and then scaling it up based on the learnings. So I think there's a lot of areas that's not working. So these barriers, like you say, barriers to entry for this economy or this space that we're in. But there's also a number of different areas that does not really connect well. And I think that is an important starting point for a scaling up approach, is to ensure that we understand where are the resource intensive sectors, how that has changed. A lot of sectors in industry have changed past COVID or post-COVID, and over the past 2 years or 3 years that we've seen a real contraction in our economy. How has things shifted in some of these different sectors with the introduction of things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms? There's also a lot of activity, and there's a lot of almost desperation to make sure that we start moving and shifting within the context of decarbonization and circularity. So starting off, understanding where are the critical touch points for us to look into and really have a real understanding of the data and the cost benefit analysis around these opportunities that we've highlighted today, integrating them into the broader economic strategy that we have for growing our economy. Of course, innovation and evidence-based policies is critical for driving that scale up. I think Anton mentioned focus on certain sectors, where circular practices can be significant in terms of reducing and improving resource efficiency. But I think mostly we have to look at that policy support. How do we incorporate and how do we create a coherence? Because, there's not a lack of policy and governance when it comes to circularity, but is how do we create that coherent national understanding of the different bits of policies and that sits across departments that can be drawn on. And there's, of course, a number of research that's been done in all of those different policy pieces and legislation. So supporting that through creating coherence and encouraging further research development innovation in circular technologies, because I think certainly there is a lot of, I think Anton used the word of leapfrogging. When we look at that, we need to really tap into technology. We need to tap in to how do we adopt 4IR principles, and even if it's getting AI technology that can help us to understand how do we take this further, how do we get the data that can help us to understand some of the trends that is changing quite rapidly. So I think that all creates an important sort of environment, and an encouraging and an enabling environment to scale up. And I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of, we've highlighted that throughout the session today. Even within the text messages or the questions, there's a lot of opportunities that's highlighted. So really scaling that up will depend on how do we create that coherent environment for it to take place. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that's probably a good point to try and start looking at some of the Q&A. I think that we're seeing some 40 or 50 people have dropped off already, because I think not everybody can manage 90 minutes. The reality is that I think we're dealing with the past, and half of that is that we keep calling it waste. We need to go back and redefine that. It needs to become resource management, not waste management. Yeah, for as long as we keep calling it waste, it's going to be a problem. And until we start to look at the opportunities to identify the value for that, it becomes an issue, and we're constantly going to be catching up the whole time. There is a lot of perception in terms of the fact that recycling is not the silver bullet. We know that, but again, it comes down to what Cheri said in terms of creating those value chains. Where do we look at that and the opportunities in terms of what's the end value, but also look at the value chain value and the supply chain values, and address all those different components as well. But also understanding that when we start to look at different products and different developments from an STI perspective, Anton, that we're addressing that also with a perspective of understanding where are we, where are those blockages in terms of moving forward with regards to procurement, material specifications, supply chain management, addressing and understanding just simple knowledge and appreciation of different products. We, for example, we still build with cement and concrete, but we have the most amazing opportunities in terms of alternative materials, which are equally as good from an engineering perspective in this country that we are avoiding. And yet that could have a massive impact with regards to, as Anton said, the reduction of our greenhouse gas emission. From that perspective, there's a lot of different ways that we can try and pull all these different bits and pieces together. So I've got a number of different questions. The one I was going to go to now, which is about the policy and regulatory gaps, I'm going to avoid that because I'm going to get hot under the collar, and really start to try and look more at going back to what the questions are on here. And I'm not sure which have been answered or not. I'm going to go to the Q&A. I think we've got 20 open and 17 answered. So great. You guys have been busy with answering the questions. That's really good. Are there any in specifically that you guys want to pick up on that have been particularly pertinent that you want to raise, or can I just pick one or two?
Chris, so there were two questions that particularly touched on tire recycling. That was, I think, more around what's the status, what's the plans around that, and accommodating that. Yeah.
All right. So I think there's a lot of information that I mean, unfortunately, there's not really that available online. But hopefully that through the Waste Bureau and through the Tire Initiative, we can get a little bit more information out there. There are a couple of things in place with regards to tenders that have gone out for depots and recycling facilities. So it is picking up again in traction, and hopefully we can look at getting things coming out of there. Yeah, I think what Flick Blakeway from Mngeni, she's saying there that again it's behavior change. We need to change the mentality. And how do we look at that consumer shift, and how do we get governments to provide the incentives and mandates to make these things happen? It's a difficult question, Flick. That the reality is that there is already a mandate with regards to through the Municipal Structures Act and through other components that municipalities are required to push source separation, try and look at avoiding landfill. There's a lot of different components there, but we do need to look at driving the policies that are there. We don't need to recreate new ones. We need to look at implementing what's there. Even if we go right back to the Polokwane Declaration, which was one of the first ones, I think it was either 2008, and by 2012 we had to achieve X, and we did nothing. So any inputs from the panelists in terms of how how we force these, well, not force, but encourage these the policies that are around to really start to get government to drive this, as well as the private sector.
I'm happy to give a contribution. I think my experience over the last few years of going from voluntary to mandatory is a little bit of a lack of accountability and a lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities. Often producer responsibility organizations are not understood as not-for-profit entities who've got a job of work to do at the best cost to society, because of course the work that we do impacts on the price of goods and services. I think in terms of separation at source, what is the role of municipalities? We have some municipalities who think that the PROs are going to do everything. We have other municipalities who say, no, they still own the waste. So you think that you can try a pilot or roll out something in one area and take it to another, but it's completely different. So I think, first of all, rolling out extended producer responsibility is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a one size fits all. So we have to build towards that. And our waste streams are found in municipal solid waste. So we need to work together. And if we can have clarity of messaging, if we can have clarity of certain standards for consumers, because they play a very key role. Very often they are the last people who handle something, whether it's packaging, whether it's a tire, whether it's electronic waste. They have the wherewithal to throw it into the environment, put it into a clear bag at the top of their wheelie bin for an informal collector to make life easy for people, to take it to a drop-off facility. If we had consistent anti-littering messages, because we're often told that if you throw things away, it may create a job for someone to pick it up, and that's just simply not true. That's wasted resources. We can use that money in municipalities far more effectively by developing sorting centers, suburban sorting centers for the informal sector to have places to sort the material they recover, to get that additional value, to understand if we roll out curbside collection, what do we tell consumers? Which do we start with? Because, and here I differ a little bit with Chris, because some waste just doesn't have value, not yet. And I think there are going to be a couple of items of waste that, put it this way, over 20 years, I haven't found a value. So, how do we do that? Because if we look at the system now and we look at the leakage, what actually gets into that leakage? So those would be some of the suggestions that I would make. And I think as well, if I look at what they call the HoReCa sector, which is the hotel, restaurant, catering sector, the out-of-home sector, we have an enormous population who are forced to travel large distances to get to work every day. And when I look at the products that we largely deal with, and of course I'm talking in the paper and packaging sector again, those hotels, restaurants, catering, events, stadiums, transport hubs are places where people are traveling, commuting, using these packages. So I think there are some strategies that we could develop and look at how we could implement them for collection ahead of others. So some thoughts for consideration.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Cheri. I think, just before, if anybody else wants to add to that, I mean, there are things that we're doing. I mean, if you look at Western Cape, for example, pushing around the organic side of things, I think that's a great initiative. Put the pressure on there, look at the alternatives, and then we can try and bring that and develop that, and extend that across the country. But there's always that issue that waste doesn't have any value, and it's always been unfortunately the excuse, particularly around the European process of incineration, is that, well, there's no use for it, but we can burn it. It's got value in burning it. And again, we want to try and avoid that last end component of just giving it an excuse to go through sort of large scale incineration. Not that I firmly believe waste to energy has a value in particular components, but smaller scale type systems that are based on proper product development. But if you look at that, again, it comes back to what Anton was saying. If you look at things like nappies, I mean, for years people used to call me the recycling guy, and I'd say you can recycle everything except the nappy. And then DFFE appointed me and said, we want you to investigate nappies. And we found 13 technologies that recycle nappies, which is great. None of them work economically in this country. So there's the problem. And there's no separation. And a nappy is still considered general waste. So it ends up in the black bag anyway, if it's not ending up in the environment. But now you're seeing the drive, and you're starting to see the pressure on the PROs and the EPR issues, where we're now starting to look at opportunities and saying, well, when you look at the constituents of that, let's go back to the design. Let's look at a biodegradable plastic. Let's look at a super absorbent polymer that's not bad for the environment. Let's look at a fiber that is useful in terms of recycling. And you start to change that value set in terms of looking at all those different components. So yes, you're right. Right now, there's a lot of stuff that's not recyclable. Anybody who wants to go to a landfill site and see some of the stuff that's coming in there, be my guest, see what you can do with it. We've got a long way to go. But I think that we need to put more pressure on the fact that we need to offset from landfill and look at some of those key components. The big ones, your builder's rubble, your metal waste as its own issue. And I see one of the questions was around metal, and I don't want to even get into that because the politics in that is quite nasty. But let's look at those key opportunities. So soil waste, builder's rubble, organics, that's 60% plus of your waste. Let's look at that as a good start and great opportunity. But again, it needs government involvement and needs issues around developing procurement. All of us here were at the Operation Pakisa in 2017. What's happened to that? We spoke about things like builder's rubble, where, if we just changed procurement policies to look at crushed rubble being 30% requirement for road subgrade, you would obliterate 7.1 million tons of waste across the country. There's opportunities, but we're not implementing them. So let's look at all those different components. Anybody else want to add to what Cheri said there?
Yeah, Chris, thanks. I think that just to clarify as well further, is that, we at Tetra Pak looked at the value chain and said, we cannot continue doing things as normal. That's why we deployed systems like MapISA, which is a software for us to track the value chain. And what we saw is that as soon as you start going into the coastal areas and the other far-flung areas, because if you look at recycling in South Africa, it's mostly concentrated in Johannesburg. We then realized that we needed to level the playing field to a certain point. And what those insights that we get from developing technology in the collection system is that we're able to go and see if it's, for example, in the Western Cape, what support do they need? We then start introducing logistics support so that we level the playing field for those people in the Eastern Cape compared to the ones in Joburg. And I believe that as we continue investing in such technologies and working with these small businesses on a day-to-day basis, we will be able to gain some traction. But it's also very important that, for us, because our packaging has got the poly-L component, we continuously work with industry to develop new products. I mean, Tetra Pak, for example, in a year, we're investing about 10 million rands. This 10 million rands, some of it goes towards research and development, working with partners like the CSIR and some local industries. By trying to do this, we're trying to introduce new products into the building sector, into, trying to work with alternative materials that can be introduced into the market. We need to build new industries out of the recycling that we're doing in the market. And all of this, for it to happen, EPR is an enabler. We need responsible companies to come together and invest into the sector and make sure that things work. And I think with the efforts that we've put in so far, we are making progress. We're not where we want to be as yet, but we believe that the interventions that we started with and as the results we're seeing, we are on the right track.
No, I'd agree with that. And I think as Cheri says, it's a marathon. It's not a race. And there's a lot to be done to address these different components. But it's also it's about understanding the perception out there and what people know and understand. And I'm attracted to a question here by Tulani Sitole, talking about the plastic in discarded IT equipment. Is that reprocessable? Again, it comes back to looking at design and designing for recyclability. We did studies, I can never remember my timelines anymore, it must be nearly 5-6 years ago, where we addressed looking at printers. And when you start to look at that from an IT perspective or a dismantling perspective, talking about dismantling, I think my Rottweiler is just dismantling my door frame at the moment. But the opportunity is that when you look at dismantling, that there was 19 different types of plastic, 19 different types of plastic. So when you're starting to look at what is recyclable, it makes it very difficult. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the different sectors around that design. You can't have 19 different types of plastic, and some are, you know, polypropylene, and then you've got a glass fiber polypropylene, and you've got a carbonaceous fiber, or you've got another type of filler in it, or you've got HIPS versus a polypropylene versus an ABS versus a PVC, and different components. And we all know that they're designed around particular components for their particular strength, their industrial strength, their thermal efficiency or the thermal resistivity. But it makes it very difficult for us to look at that. And that's where we're starting to see this change, where we need people to start looking at this design for recyclability, and really move it in that direction, because otherwise we're not going to win the war. And we need to look at that. Any of the team want to pick up on any of the other specific questions that are on there, or can I pick up one or two? Flick says I mustn't get hot under the collar. I always get hot under the collar, Flick. That's what I do. Does Tetra Pak work with spaza shop distribution? If Masale, if you could just talk about some of the work that you're doing in terms of getting down to the market.
Thanks, Chris. Look, for us, Tetra Pak, we're a producer of the packaging material, and not necessarily the brand owner that distributes this material, this packaging to different retailers or other areas. So unfortunately, no, we do not work with spaza shops. Who we work with is the buyback centers and communities in terms of developing collections and trying to boost the amount of cartons we get back into the system.
Yep. That's the thing, is that one's got to look at it realistically, that we can't be everywhere for everyone all the time. And I think that's the reality of one of the issues we're faced with. There's a question by Gavin Singh as well about looking at converting products into fuel. Been there, done that. There's a lot of these different things out there. But approach the likes of the CSR, and there's a circular economy demonstration facility as well, which is something that one can look at. Reach out. There are different ways that one can look at that. The Technology Innovation Agency and DSI, they all do different work into those different components. Thank you, Anton. I see you putting an answer in there. And really then just looking at trying to finalize the different components. We're sitting with 8 minutes left. What I'd prefer to do, I think, is give each of you an opportunity at privatizing municipal waste dumps. Thanks, John. That would be a great idea, but that's again politically hot potato. Is maybe just a closing statements from each of you. I think we all know that and we all believe in this room, I think that circularity is provides the sort of systemic opportunity to change and to move forward. And I think we've got a long way to go. We all recognize that, but we're all on that journey. Some of us for longer than others. So maybe just some closing remarks. Cheri, from yourself.
I was trying to send you a silent message. Don't start with me. But you know, I must admit, sometimes I sit and I feel a bit overwhelmed by how we're going to get where we want to be. But in honesty, if I look back over the past 20 years, we've come a long way. If I look at how we took the Petco model, that model of building a sustainable value chain, how we applied it to liquid board packaging, and how we actually exceeded the target in year 2 is testament to how that model can work. I
Encouraging.
think that it's possible to make it work for other materials as well. I think if we can look at the reduction of some of the complexities of polymers, so that where potentially we can use less of them, you know, it's like cords for charging cell phones. Every time you get a different item, I mean, my iPad and my iPhone, I can't use the same headphones. It drives me absolutely mad. Now that's just totally unnecessary. So if we can do that across packaging and really work together, really collaborate, I think unfortunately we still have quite a bit of competition, whether it's between manufacturers of materials or streams of materials or areas of the value chain that you belong to. So I would really like to leave with a thought: how do we collaborate more? How do we actually truly unlock that word collaboration and understand that competition, certainly in a PRO space, should happen with the commercial service providers. It should happen at the collection and recycling level. It should not happen at the PRO level. We should be doing the work that we do on a collaborative basis at the best cost to society. So that's where I think I'd like to leave it,
Thank
Chris.
you. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Anton, some closing words?
Yeah, so from my side, I mean, I think it's come through quite a lot in the discussion, you know, the need for policy coherence and then also collaboration across the various actors. And I think that's absolutely critical for the circular economy, because it is such a systems concept, and it requires this integration across the full value chain and between all different partners. So I think, you know, as we've said, a more supportive policy framework is really needed. You know, coherent policy across the full life cycle, both upstream and downstream. And then also there's a need for you know, an appropriate custodian to really be taking the lead and to ensure that there's coordinated efforts towards a common vision to make sure that we're not all pulling in different directions, and to ensure coherent policy development. And I think this will also provide certainty and create confidence among businesses, as well as de-risking investment.
Appreciate it. Quite right. I think that's, yeah, we've all got to come together. Like cooperation, collaboration is important. Masale, final comments.
Oh, thanks, Chris. I think I echo the same sentiment as the other panelists, that collaboration is quite key. But also what we need is that we need proper partnerships between private and public as well to advance the circular economy. And on the private sector, where we come from, that I would think, speaking for our companies, that, you know, our continued investments into the circular economy and also fostering innovation to bring new products into the market will also help us go a long way. So I think, yeah, we still have a long way to go, but I think in the last few years that I've been involved with Tetra Pak, we've made the right steps. And I think, you know, what got us here is not exactly what is going to get us to where we want to be. But as we continuously innovate and come up with new ideas, we should make good progress in the coming future. Thank you. It's been quite insightful.
Good. Thank you. Lee, some last words.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I think today's discussion is just testament to how much is already being achieved and done in our country, and a lot for us to build on. My final comments is just on one of the questions that came up that particularly touch on the importance of business to comply with the development of circular economy, you know, roadmaps and practices and policies. And of course, how that also, that tension that really comes up when we look at profit making versus the impact on the environment. So again, from our side, interacting and engaging, interfacing with industry, this is something that we deal with and that we are involved on a daily basis. Our engagement with, for instance, Circular Innovation, which is hosted in the CSIR under leadership of Prof. Lee-Hendor Godfrey. From our side, we are now hosting the Circular Manufacturing Initiative that exactly looks at how do we bring industry and academia and RDI practices and focuses closer to each other to look at issues of supporting industry to adopt technology and solutions around circularity, circular business models based on evidence and research-based solutions in the areas of advanced manufacturing, circular design, remanufacturing. So we're looking forward to taking this to industry in a much more structured way, relying on research and innovation, linking with academia. And we'll be hosting a webinar in the near future to actually initiate this discussion. So I think today was really a really good opportunity to highlight the opportunities and the challenges that we have going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are out of time, so a quick thank you from myself to the panelists. Always great chatting to you. I think it's always encouraging that there are some good things happening. We have a long way to go. We know that we're on a journey, but I'd like to hand over quickly to Shannon just to say thank you and the goodbyes.
Thanks so much, Chris. That brings us to the end of a really fascinating webinar. Thank you so much to our facilitator, Chris Whyte, for enabling a robust and engaging discussion on the importance of waste management and the circular economy. Thank you also to our panelists, Lee-Hendor Ruiters from the National Cleaner Production Centre, South Africa, Masale Manoko from Tetra Southern Africa, Cheri Scholtz from Petco, and Anton Nahman from the CSIR. A big thank you to our sponsors, Tetra the National Cleaner Production Centre South Africa, and EnviroServe for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion. Our next webinar takes place on Wednesday, 26 March at 2 p.m. and focuses on water and how to fix fragile infrastructure to build a water-secure future for all businesses and communities. The link to register for that webinar will be shared soon. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time and goodbye.